Welcome everyone. Today we're gonna go through the analysis of the schematics of all the connections of the UEFA Euro 2020 opening ceremony that happened in Rome a few weeks ago for the European Football Championships. I've been personally hired by Filmmaster, which is the company producing the opening ceremony. And I had with the Italian team the responsibility to provide feeds for the broadcast and the field of play and for the PA, which was, installed inside of the Stadio Olimpico, the Olympic Stadium in Rome. The peculiar things which are happening during those occasions is that you really cannot fail. You are broadcasted worldwide and you only have 12 minutes of show from, in the case of the opening ceremony, from 8:35 to 8:47, right? So you really literally have 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, you don't have any time to recover and to change something if something is happening, and therefore you have to have a redundant plan in place, trying to understand which are all the potential, unlucky situations or failures or something like that, and you always have to have a prompt, whenever possible, automatic redundancy method in place, which hopefully and eventually will not interrupt, not even for a sample, your audio show. I'm talking about audio with nothing to do with video things. And worst case scenario, if you have multiple unlucky situations, it is acceptable that if you pile up, unfortunate situation on top of other unfortunate situations, so you might have to change something manually, such as changing a cable or recalling a different snapshot or something which is repatching something. But most of the time, you really need to have a flawless changeover of feeds or combination in order to prevent any interruption in the audio distribution towards the PA and last but not least, definitely towards the broadcast track, which is then getting your feeds and distributed worldwide. So in those occasions, of course, was not my first gig. I did very important gigs during my unfortunately long career. And there's a mix of political issues and technical issues. Sometimes the political ones are not less difficult than the technical ones, especially when you have to draw a line in terms of responsibilities, and it is very hard to cross the border, and therefore some of the decisions are driven by political things rather than technical things. And this case was not an exception. So in order to let you understand which were the, let's say, the boundaries, which were the boundaries of our responsibility, I prepared a bunch of schematics. And the same schematics are really helpful to understand which were all the backup plans that I had in place in case one or more than one unfortunate situation would have been, happening. Which, of course, the day that you have everything ready and anything can happen, nothing will happen. And nothing happened, so I can say that whatever I'm going to show you today has been completely, I wouldn't say useless, but it was not required in the end because nothing went wrong. Everything worked perfectly, from the microphone preamplifiers and the radio microphones, the Pro Tools rig, the console, the Prodigy, the Dante networking, the switches. We didn't have a single failure, right? But we were ready to multiple failures and different combination of failures, and we wouldn't have any problem at all. If you work under those circumstances with all the potential backup plan in place, you work much better. You can focus on your artistic, aspects, and you can enjoy the ceremony even if the responsibility is extremely, extremely big. So let's try to change the view here and share the first schematic I'm going to show you. As I told you, for political reasons, we were, myself and Arturo Pereglini, which was the sound engineer and the playback guy as well, so he was managing his Pro Tools rig. I was the one getting the feeds from the console, the feeds from the several microphones that we had in the control room, and I had to put together in a main way using a Dante primary and secondary feed towards the PA and the broadcast, which was connected with Dante. So we were in the control room and we had a couple of fibers connecting two different switches. The switches on the field of play level were feeding the PA and the broadcast. So that was the decision took by the UEFA, and we had to divide, for political reasons and for responsibilities aspects, completely their Dante networking from our Dante networking. And in order to do that, we simply use a PRODIGY.MP, which I called MP2 Dante bridge, which is available, which is capable of running two independent networking. One networking slot was fed with a Dante SRC I/O. That Dante SRC I/O was completely under the control of the UEFA portion. So I was sitting on a Dante network just for the audio exchange back and forth, 64 channel at 48 kilohertz, but I didn't have any possibility to change priority, clocking, patching. I was not even able to open the Dante controller for the Dante SRC card that I had here. I could only get from my Prodigy the 64 feeds, and I could have decided which were the 64 channels that I was sending out towards that. So having two independent connections straight from my Dante primary connection and the Dante secondary connection of the Dante SRC card, we had completely independent management responsibilities and clock domain, because I was not sitting on a synchronous network, but this card was slave on the clock of the Dante from the PA and the broadcast. But in order to have completely independency in terms of clocking, I was using the Dante SRC, the HD, the high definition sample rate converter on board of the network adapter card inside of the PRODIGY.MP switched on. So I could have sent any clock information out, meaning 44.1, 96, 48, my clock, whatever. The signals coming from my PRODIGY.MP towards the PA and broadcast Dante environment would have been converted towards their own clock and their own sample rate frequency. The same for the other way around. So whatever I was receiving from their Dante domain would have been, and that has been converted towards the clock decision that I took inside of the PRODIGY.MP number 2. So that was the main connection between us, the control room, and PA and broadcast. The way that PA and broadcast has been managed was not our responsibility. Of course, I investigated a little bit to understand if everything was okay, and I had a chat with both the PA guys and the broadcast guys, and everything was working very well. In order to have an extra level of redundancy, we can consider somehow a redundant connection already, the fact that you have a primary and a secondary of Dante. But, for example, if something goes wrong in both of the switches or in the device that I was using to make this bridge, we would have been completely separated. We were feeding several feeds towards the field of play for PA and broadcast, and we were receiving back from the field of play the 4 RF radio microphone for the two football players, saying just few words such as Ciao Roma and Ciao Euro, for the two famous Italian players, Francesco Totti and Alessandro Nesta. The Bocelli's microphone, of course, and Bocelli's wife microphone, which was, of course, not broadcasted, but was important for him to receive the voice of the wife in his in-ear monitors. The in-ear monitors were mixed from us, from Arturo, in our control room, but the physical connection of the transmitters of the in-ears were at the field of play, therefore connected to the PA and broadcast Dante domain. In order to have an extra level of redundancy, whatever happened to the Dante side, no matter if it was primary or secondary, we fed again all our feeds from the another couple of PRODIGY.MPs using the analog outputs. Good old analog outputs as a backup towards the field of play, so broadcast and PA were receiving a backup of the backup, analog. So we were providing program left and right, which was our mix, a music clean feed different from the vocals clean feed. That was a specific request from the PA guys in order to have the possibility to balance differently towards the PA system in the stadium whenever needed, the level of the vocals and the level of the music. And then 4 different or 6 different in-ear monitor feeds managed by the Yamaha CL5 in the control room. 4 of them were for Bocelli, his wife, and the 2 football players. And in-ear monitor number 5 and 6 were for performance, such as the tambourine bands and the marching bands and other stuff. Those ones were feeding FM transmitters because there were a lot of receivers on the other hand, and therefore they were receiving FM transmission. But from our point of view, basically we could consider them 6 in-ear monitor feeds mono. Then we had to provide inside of the control room, and there were just analog, not just as a backup, some feeds for monitoring left and right for the front of house engineers, a monitor mono for the rest of the guys inside of the control room, and then 2 important signals which were distributed from the PRODIGY.MP, which I called MP3, number 3, which was the LTC, the linear time code, the SIMT for the pyros. Of course, all the pyros were pre-programmed and they were based on the same LTC, produced by the Pro Tools and distributed towards the pyros and also towards the lighting consoles. Consoles because, of course, also the colleagues from the lighting department, they were using redundant structure, therefore they had 2 consoles in mirror. Both of them were receiving an LTC from an analog out. So there were the signals that we had to provide. So how we did manage the connections inside of the control room. So I guess at that point it's quite clear we had to provide a bunch of channels down to the field of play. The main connection bidirectional was a Dante SRC back and forth, the field of play and the control room, backed up with analog feeds for the PA and broadcast, and fixed analog, no backup in this case because we were exactly in the same physical room, so we had physical connection of the local analog output towards the active speakers for the monitoring, left and right for the sound engineer, monitor for the choreographer and the show caller, and LTC for separate LTC, which identical feeds for pyros and lighting consoles. Then we had few microphones coming from the field of play, already mentioned, 4 radio microphones, Bocelli, his wife, and the 2 football players, coming from Dante and then receive from these from this MP2, and we had inside of the control room 2 analog microphone connected. One was the show caller, extremely important feed because the show caller, not for the intercom purpose, which is a completely different distribution management, but because the show caller was one of the feeds required in order to prepare the in-ear monitor feeds. So Bocelli was listening for the show caller, his wife, the two football players, and all the performance inside of the field of play were connected not via intercom, but with the show caller microphone. So that was an important feed that we couldn't lose. The other one was for the choreographer. The choreographer was, giving information and orders just to a portion of the performance. For example, all the dancers. I do not know if you had the chance to look at the performance, but there were singers and singers were just Bocelli, but dancers and people going up and down, balloons and blah blah blah. So the choreographer was taking care about the artistic portion of the dancing and stuff like that. Long story short, two microphone preamplifier inside of the same control room where we were in the top roof of the stadium. So in order to have the maximum redundancy, we didn't want to connect those two microphones straight to the console because the console could have failed. So we wanted to start with an analog split of those two microphones and feeding two independent microphone preamplifiers board, one on board of the first Prodigy called MP2, which was renamed Dante bridge because that was the one making the bridge between the local Dante inside of the control room and the external Dante, which is the one from UEFA for the PA and broadcast, which I called it MP2 Dante bridge, which was the main function of that PRODIGY.MP, even if it's not the only one, but the main function was the Dante bridge. So the MP2 Dante bridge was receiving those two microphones, and an analog split was feeding the second MP that I had in the control room, which I called backup mix. The main function of the MP number one has been to be ready to become the backup console in case of failure of the complete console, the Yamaha CL5. So I had to split all the inputs towards the first MP1, because it should have been ready to become the main console in case of a failure of the console, and I had to feed the Yamaha CL5 with all the potential inputs, including radio microphone from the field of play, Pro Tools playback. We will have a much deeper analysis of the Pro Tools rig with all the feeds and the way that Pro Tools has been connected, and the local microphone for the show caller and the choreographer and stuff like that. So that is the main schematic about the global thing. So analog split for the local microphone in the control room, split it in two different Prodigy's MPs. The Prodigy's MPs were converting those to microphone level preamplifier into a Dante feed, putting those information as a main and as a backup, not straight to Dante, but going through an input manager. We will have a look at that, and that's an extremely important aspect to increase the level of redundancy. If you really want to have an automatic redundancy, not only on the Pro Tools side, but also on all the other feeds that you have to play with. So the logical schematic, which is not just geological, but pretty much the physical one, was all the three Prodigy MPs were connected to the same Dante networking through different switches for redundancy purpose, but all the switches were connected in stack. Therefore, we didn't want to completely divide primary and secondary for different switches, but in every switch we had two different VLANs, actually four different VLANs, but for Dante two different VLANs, one for primary and one for secondary. So every switch was doing at the same time primary and secondary, but since the switches were connected in stack, thanks to the expertise of the Vivivaldi crew that helped us in designing the Ethernet infrastructure there, all the switches were connected with trunking lines, bringing all the different tagging of the several VLANs. So, and then going into the detail, we connected the way the several devices, Dante devices, in a way that a single failure of a single switch couldn't have broken the entire path. You just have to pay attention and do it in the right way, and you really have a very, very high level of redundancy. So that is basically the connections. So The third MP3 was just there mainly as a spare, or just in case you needed to distribute or to collect last minute signals from anywhere in the stadium. We would have laid down, or not laid down, because all the fibers were already laid down, just connected a couple of fibers all over the stadium and connected the device. But since we didn't need it around the stadium, we kept it in the control room as a spare device, and since it was already there, the last minute I decided to divide further the responsibility and the probability of failure, and that one was the one feeding, for example, the local LTC and the pyros and some of the analog feeds, to divide the risk in case the analog backup would have been needed. So that is the schematic from the logical point of view. Then you have to start thinking. As I told you, we will spend a lot of time talking about the several aspects of the redundancy, both for the input managers and for the ears, and hence automatic redundancy switches, switching especially for Pro Tools. But first, we have to understand if those connections were reliable enough in case of failure and different kind of failure. So if everything would have worked in the right direction, which was the case, fortunately, the standard situation would have been the MP2 bridge getting the feeds from the microphone locally, getting the feeds from the stage for the radio microphones, making the exchange back and forth, the Dante external, let's call it like that, and the Dante internal, having Pro Tools connected to both the Prodigy's MPs, and to have a full redundant, much more than redundant, Pro Tools managed by the Prodigy and then injected into Dante for the console. So the console was having from Dante primary and Dante secondary both the feeds of the local microphone, remote microphone, and Pro Tools. The console was mixing everything: main, program left and right, monitor feeds for the broadcast, for the control room, the several in-ear monitor feeds, music clean, music, vocal clean, connected to Dante back to the Prodigy, which was, doing the Dante bridge and feeding the broadcast and the Dante, external Dante feeds. This is exactly what was the standard connection. No, of course, a snapshot required, but just the standard one. And that, I couldn't have not touched any single thing, and which is exactly what happened, and everything is going straight. Then you have to understand, okay, usually the Yamaha console are extremely reliable. I don't remember by memory a single failure of a Yamaha console in my entire career, but you have 12 minutes, anything can happen. So you need to be prepared to the catastrophe of the complete console for some reason is breaking up. Okay, so no panic if you have everything in place. So if you have to replace the complete console, either you have an identical console and you repeat everything, or since the number of the channels in this case to be mixed were not exaggerated, we could use one of the two Prodigy.MP as a complete backup console. In that case, failing the Yamaha CL5, we could have the Yamaha fault, right? And the Yamaha fault could have been recovered completely by determining the Prodigy.MP number 1 as a backup mix. The backup mix was receiving all the feeds from the field of play through the Dante networking, from the local microphones through the analog direct feed, and from Pro Tools directly from the Pro Tools rig, feeding the Dante external and the analog, and therefore we could survive completely the complete fault of the Yamaha with no problem at all. In that case, I wouldn't even need to recall a snapshot, because, as you could see later on, what I was really feeding towards the Dante SRC was the combination of the input manager, meaning real-time checking of main and redundant feed, compare the Yamaha CL5 and the first Prodigy.MP mix. Since the Yamaha CL5 was there and was having higher priority, That was the normal path for the input manager, and therefore whatever I was sending towards Dante was the result of the Yamaha CL5. But as soon as the feeds from the Yamaha would have disappeared, without even recalling a snapshot, automatically within few milliseconds, the coherence level detection of the PRODIGY.MP, which was doing the bridge, would have been substituting the entire number of feeds from the Yamaha from the MP1 backup mix, and therefore I was able to feed completely the broadcast and the analog with no problem at all. If you are extremely unlucky and you say, okay, you determined the MP1 as a backup mix, but since it's not your lucky star that night, not only the Yamaha fails, but it fails also the one which was supposed to be the backup console. Well, usually at a certain point you have to stop thinking redundant, right? You cannot have everything redundant, but it would have been a stupid idea not to make use of the second PRODIGY.MP of a second backup console you had already there. It was just a matter of preparing a bunch of snapshots to change some, internal patching. So in case of a Yamaha plus the MP1, the PRODIGY.MP number 1 fault, very, very unfortunate situation, I had to give up with something. For example, the analog feed were coming from the MP1, but since the Pro Tools, all the microphone, the local microphone, the remote microphone were already available for this device, determining this device as a backup of the backup console would have let me keep going on with no problem at all with both Dante main and Dante redundant, Dante primary and Dante secondary towards PA in broadcast with no problem at all. In order to do that, I would have had to recall a global snapshot inside Globcon, because as you will see later on, I had to change some of the routing depending on the configuration, and therefore Yamaha plus MP1 fault global snapshot required. So I would have recalled that global snapshot. Something should have happened towards this device and the third device, right? And therefore a global snapshot is the perfect fit for that, because you don't have to think. You just have a name of a snapshot which is telling you exactly what that snapshot is for. So if that shit happen, you just hit the button and whatever should be recalled in the first device is recalled, whatever should be recalled in the second device is recalled, and then you're ready to go. Last but not least, in order to test during the rehearsal, few hours before, all your redundant action, you need to have a standard global snapshot in place, default 1 global snapshot, default 2 or fault 2 global snapshot, in order to go back and forth and really test everything as if, because then you can really have the guarantee that whatever you thought, whatever your snapshot, whatever your cabling and whatever, can really be perfectly working whenever needed. The warning is, since this is not the first level of redundancy, but is the Yamaha combined with a PRODIGY.MP fault, very unlikely both of the devices are equipped with redundant power supply. Both of them have one feeds from the mains and the other one from the UPS, uninterrupted power supplies and stuff like that. But never say never. You only have 12 minutes. Remember, you cannot fail. So you have to consider that if you are really, really unlucky, you have multiple and uncorrelated failures, which must be managed. And therefore, you have the global snapshot that you can recall, but you also have a warning. In this case, the backup analog feeds towards the PA and broadcast are not available, because you are, putting into the picture the fact that you are losing the device which was providing those analog feeds. Unless you want to rewire analog feeds from another device, which could have been a possibility, but that would require too much time for a 12-minute show, and therefore the first level of reaction must be something which, worst case scenario, requires a recall patch or recall snapshot, not rewiring cable. At least this is what I think. That was the case of Yamaha fault or MP1 fault. But the MP2, which was also another key PRODIGY.MP, which was the one making the bridge between the field of play and the control room, could have failed. Okay, this is a very, very heavy situation because that was the main Dante connection, external Dante connection towards PA and broadcast. That's the reason why we wanted to have an analog feed. And therefore, we were ready to survive even to the main connection between internal Dante and external Dante. So we would have been needed to keep going on even without the PRODIGY.MP number 2. How? Just using the analog feeds. So the Yamaha console could have been working perfectly, thanks to the fact that Dante is connecting all the devices. This one is not acting like a backup mix because that is not needed because the Yamaha is, working perfectly. But the analog feeds were, connecting the broadcast and the PA even without Dante. But the standard global snapshot is required, so I wouldn't even have to recall another global snapshot because that was absolutely already the standard situation. But we have to be careful that, and this is something that I warned UEFA about, but they said, well, that is not something that we want to cover. Warnings, the radio microphone from the field of play would have not been available because we only had one way of analog connections. So they would have received our analog feeds, such as the Pro Tools left and right, mix, and the local microphones, and blah, blah, blah. But we would have lost the microphone from the field of play, which are the two players and Bocelli. Therefore, they said, okay, that is really, really unfortunate situation, and worst case scenario, we are not completely muted because you are still feeding the things, and so, we would have, and then Arturo, we would have, maybe unmuted some tracks from Pro Tools to, overcome the problem of losing Bocelli from the field of play. But, that was managed in that way. That was the general thing. Now, in order to understand how that, would have been possible, I need you to understand how the years, in order to understand how Pro Tools was connected, and which were all the, potential catastrophe scenarios. And especially, maybe you are already familiar with years, the enhanced automatic redundancy switching, how it is working in the Xbox MDs, for example, which is not that different inside of the MP, although it's more powerful because you have more options. But what might be new to you is the input manager, which was an extremely important portion of the redundancy plan that we had in place. So what we have in front of us are the 3 virtual devices represented, which were the real ones that I used that night. Then I have another Prodigy, which is a real one, the one that I'm using to broadcast this event. So this is not, that was not part of the, but this is the one that I want to use for real examples. During that night, I had a bunch of layouts ready. That would have been the console backup number 1 that Arturo should have mixed on, of course, before the show and after the rehearsal, the final rehearsal. We copied all the information from the console in terms of levels, EQs, dynamics, and feeds, and ear monitor feeds. We could recreate internally inside of the PRODIGY.MP 100% of the features. We didn't have to give up with anything available from the Yamaha CL5. As I told you, we were not mixing 200 channels. We were mixing, you can see 2 channels for the Pro Tools left and right, Bocelli, his wife, Totti and Nesta, show caller, Korea, a couple of clicks, 2 different clicks, one for the tambourine guys and the other one for the marching bands. And then we had a bunch of outputs, master left and right, music clean, music vocal clean. Totti and Nesta was one of the in-ear monitor, the drummers, the dancers, Bocelli, the FM1, balloon, and FM2 marching. There were the number of inputs and outputs, which is, surprisingly, not that different from any big opening that I worked on. Usually you don't have thousands of channels, at least in the main console, which is, playing back things and stuff like that. If there's a big live show, there's another console which is just reducing the number of the channels that are arriving to you into a left and right or few feeds. So I remember in Beijing in 2008 when I was there for Optical for the opening and opening and closing ceremony, I was distributing a bunch of mono feeds You know, although we had an incredible amount of speakers all over the stadium, SIMT, pyros, and stuff like that, but the original channels and the sources channel usually in those occasions are not that much. And therefore, the PRODIGY.MP is a perfect device to enable a lot of different connection, format conversions, level of redundancy, and console redundancy. Because the PRODIGY.MP could have been the console itself. Of course, the sound engineer always preferred to have a console for control purposes, you know, to have all the faders, to have all the, you know, to get familiar with the workflow. But if something goes wrong, you can rely definitely on the internal DSP capabilities of the PRODIGY.MP, and usually have more than enough for such an opening and closing ceremony. Then I had another backup mix number 2. Looks identical, but it's from a completely different device. That would have been the Dante bridge. See, Dante bridge. So I had the selected channel open. So if I had to, in real time, change the EQ from Bocelli or something like that, usually that doesn't happen during an open ceremony. But you know, nevertheless, you know, you have the real-time possibility to do that whenever you want to do it. No problem at all. You have groups, you have VCAs, you have everything you need. But today is not the seminar about the PRODIGY.MP, you know, to be used as a console. But it's important to know that combining the PRODIGY.MP and Globcon, which is an extremely powerful software developed around the PRODIGY.MP, you can really have the entire control under the entire situation under control. Then I had the normal feeds. If the console was in charge, and it actually was, the Prodigy set was just the one collecting all the feeds from the microphone, converted towards the console, and getting back from the console the several feeds to feed the broadcast with Yamaha main left and right, Yamaha backup left and right, Yamaha in-ears from 1 to 6, music clean and vocal cleans, and you know, the analog, you know, versions of that, plus the 3 monitor and monos and the monitor left and right. And remember, the LTC was, you know, fed directly from Pro Tools with all the redundant aspects towards the pyros and the lighting consoles. Then, how did I manage, for example, the microphone preamplifier inside of the Dante Bridge device? So let me close down everything here and open this device here and show you how the input manager is working. The input manager, we were using a bunch of them, 1 and 2 for Pro Tools left and right, then click 1 and click 2, then show caller and choreographer, and then LTC. 7 different input managers. What is an input manager? It's a DSP block which has up to 6 different hardware input into a logical output DSP based on the availability from top down in terms of priority, and it is working in this way. If priority source number 1 in this case was a Pro Tools main music left coming from a Dante feed, if that is available and it has locking information, Dante is connected and valid. And based also on level coherence, what if Dante is available, but for some reason I'm not getting that signal? Dante is there, the carrier is there, but there's no music. And therefore, the level coherence is also checking if the main signal and the redundant signal are identical, if they are coherent, and if one of the two is disappearing, the other one immediately becomes the candidate to be the one sent actually towards the output of the input manager. So you can have up to 6 different hardware input. In this case, we only needed 2 for both. And which were the 2 things? Coming back to the schematic, you see an important piece here. In the standard situation, I had not only Dante connecting my 2 Prodigies MPs, but also a MIDI coaxial from one device and the others. Maybe you've seen a couple of pictures, but I had this Prodigy MP literally side by side on the other one. So a MIDI coaxial cable of 5 meters, bidirectional, were connecting, two cables were connecting the 2 devices. So in case I would have lost, for some reason, one of the two Pro Tools rig, right? Lorenzo is telling me that there are many questions, and therefore, did all the PRODIGY.MP appears in one common Globcon instance? Of course. Okay, there are many questions, but let me finish a little bit, and then we will keep some time to answer all the questions, right? In the meantime, Lorenzo is feeding me with all the questions, so thank you for your question. So, if I'm having a failure on the Pro Tools on the Dante side for any reason, on top of the years, we will see that. But if I still have the same signal on a MADI version from the twin device, then I can be sure that either one is valid, and therefore I can route towards the rest of my processing, which can be a Dante feed output or an MADI feed output or an analog feed output, the result of the operation of the input manager. And this is not just based on the locking availability of the several signals, an AES carrier, a MADI carrier. Of course, if you don't have a MADI information, it means that there's no audio at all. But you might have the MADI carrier, and for some reason, that input channels, the audio channels inside of that MADI feed is not there. And therefore, the coherence is reacting. And this is also allowing you to have an analog feed as a main source, because it's not, the locking will never be lost on an analog input, but the audio coherence could be lost if there's no audio coming in that analog signal. And therefore, combining locking and audio coherence among several inputs will increase drastically the level of redundancy that you can offer. So that trick has been used for all the feeds, both from the microphone preamplifier and the Dante feeds. So going back here and going back to the general schematic, what I was feeding with the analog input was the input manager for the microphones, both in this device and this device. So I was ready to back up any failure even at the level of the preamplifier. If the single amplifier would have failed, I would have sent not the local version, but the version coming from the twin device, and I would have sent towards Dante, and therefore towards the console, the feeds of any of the two shock collars. So I had even the microphone preamplifier input backed up automatically. I didn't have to switch anything, I didn't have to recall anything, but was just a result of the input manager, right? So that is extremely important. Let me show you how the input manager is working. Let's play something. So I'm going to play a typical track. So this is the input manager feed, right? In this input manager, this is the network number 1, which is coming from Dante input number 1. So Dante network number 1. This is coming from an Xbox MD, right? And the Xbox MD is connected towards this PRODIGY.MP via MADI. So from the MADI number 2, I'm receiving the conversion of Dante made by the Xbox MD in a MADI version, with the purpose to show you that if I unpatch the Dante feeding the network number 1 with Dante controller, and I'm listening to the input manager, I immediately have the backup version of that signal coming from a MADI signal. The fact that it's a MADI signal or a Dante signal doesn't make any difference. In an input manager, you can have any hardware format input among all the hardware input available inside of a Prodigy series. So therefore, analog, AES, MADI 1, MADI 2, network number 1, Dante, Ravenna, and whatever. And remember, it doesn't really matter which is the synchronism and the clock information, because once they are inside of the internal matrix of the Prodigy.MP, they've been already, if needed, through a bidirectional sample rate converter, and therefore, once available as an input for the input manager, they are all equal at the same clock and the same sample rate that you decided to have inside of your Prodigy.MP. So if I go to the input manager now, and I open Dante controller, and I bring Dante controller in the same screen where you have it here, and I go to the routing, and in the PRODIGY.MP, I give up with the first channel, right? Look at that. Okay, we are here. So I'm giving up with the first channel from the MacBook Pro 15. If I take this off, you will see that the failure of just the left channel, since I decided to use the linked to one version for the second one, which means that left and right, they are, correlated. So if I just lose the left or the right, please consider a failure of the both, because I want to keep the redundant version and they must be perfectly aligned in phase. And therefore, if they are coming from a MADI or a Dante source, you don't want to have the left which is not perfectly aligned with the right. So in case of a failure of either one, left or right, and left or and right, you have to consider the first choice failing, and therefore immediately switching over the redundant one. So I'm gonna repatch that, and since you have an automatic enabling, as soon as the network one is valid again, he's made the right side is valid again, the input manager will revert back to the original one. Now, I'm gonna go back to the flex channel and mix that into the feed towards the streaming of this webinar, so you can really listen to that. I'm unmuting this, maybe reducing a little bit the volume, just to have the possibility to talk on top of that. I go back to the input manager and I remove one of the patch. Dante is not failing, but audio is not getting there. Boom. The audio coherence is not there any longer. Therefore, you have no audio in the main, you have audio in the back, and then immediately have a backup solution without even touching something. If that is back, the console is back. Now, this is the basic idea around the input manager, which is extremely important, because on top of the analysis that we will do regarding the Pro Tools rig, which is one of the most important things when you have such an opening and act, where Pro Tools is not important just for the playback music, but is also the time machine, which is giving time to pyros, to lighting and stuff like that. So everything is dependent on the Pro Tools rig in most of the occasions, and therefore you really need to have a strong redundant plan in place. So now that you know how the input manager is working, you understand why I wanted to have exchanging between the MP number 1 and MP number 2 with a bidirectional MADI. Whatever would have been available here would immediately have been available on the other side, and vice versa. So, and that was completely independent from the Dante connection. That is extremely important. So we could survive any kind of failure among Dante connection switches or something, and we could rely on it even at the level of the single microphone preamplifier. Okay, so now that is clear. Now I think I owe you a quick demonstration of how ears is working inside of the PRODIGY.MP, because maybe you're not familiar with that. So let's go to the settings and go to ears. When you enable ears in the PRODIGY.MP, you can actually enable ears on multiple input ports. Ears is enhanced automatic redundancy switching. Between or among what? If you are activating ears on MADI 1, it means that you want to back up the entire MADI input, substituting all the 64 potential channels of that MADI input port with something else. And therefore, I can activate that, and I can decide that MADI 1 can be backed up with MADI 2, or the network 2A, or network 2B if you wanted, or network 1 in case it would have not been used already for other things. So ears in the PRODIGY.MP can be activated independently and separately on MADI 1. In that case, you are ready to replace the input stream, completely the input stream of MADI 1 with something else, which can be the second MADI, the first 64 channel of network number 1, the first 64 channel of network number 2, the second 64 channel of network number 2, if the network number 2 is capable of 128 channels, which is the case of this instance, which is hosting a Ravenna card. Then you can have an independent scenario for the second MADI input. So you could use the MADI input number 2 as a backup of MADI input number 1, but at the same time, you could make a backup the MADI number 2 with Dante or with Ravenna, or, and this is the things that we used in both the Prodigy we used for the opening ceremony, you can also divide the first half of Dante and keep it separated from the second half of Dante. Therefore, if you are happy with 32 channels of playback, more precisely 31 playback tracks plus the BLDS. BLDS is the trigger tone, is the pilot tone that is used to judge if that stream or that half of a stream of Dante is good or not, and we will have a look at that. And you can consider that if you're using net 1 as a first half is one option, or if you want to use a different port, you can back up the entire 64 channel of Dante with, at that point, another 64 channel from another Dante card in the second network, a MADI port, or a second, network which is from a different, format, such as a SoundGrid, such as Ravenna, whatever. In this case, I wanted to differentiate the first half and the second half, and I was backing up the second half of Dante with the first one and vice versa. What that means? It means that when you patch in input your Dante feeds inside of your system, you have to be extremely careful, because when ears is taking over and exchanging the first half with the second half, the entire 32 channels of the first half are substituted with the second portion patched from channel 33 through 64 inside of your Dante controller. So if it's normal to have Dante 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 for the Pro Tools, feeds that I had, music left and right, click, 1 and 2, LTC and BLDS. BLDS must be routed fixed to channel number 32 if you are using half of the Dante, or towards channel 64 if you are just using the full Dante ears backup. In case you are using a half and half, you have to feed twice the BLDS. The first channel is the last channel of the first chunk, so channel 32, and then you have to feed with the redundant feed from the second Pro Tools rig connected to the same Dante rig towards Dante channel 64. That is quite normal, so you have different feeds from channel 17 and 49 because they are different sources. But in case ears, because of the Pro Tools failure, would have swapped between the main first half and the backup second half, you have to remember that the channels which are not coming from Pro Tools must be patched again in the relevant channels, because the entire first half is substituted then by the second one. So you would be good with Pro Tools, but you would have lost the radio microphone coming from the external Dante rig and all the other feeds from the Yamaha consoles and stuff like that. So when you are using ears on Dante half and half for hybrid situation, and when I say hybrid, I mean some of the feeds are coming from Pro Tools, which are the real reason why you want to have a redundant feed, and ears, and you are feeding some other channels of Dante for other purposes, which are not backed up because you don't have two different sources, but the sources are the same ones. You have to patch twice channel number 1 and channel number 3, the same things which are coming from Dante. In that case, whenever ears is swapping between the first half and the second half, the real Pro Tools is backed up, but all the others are simply keep going on, with no problem at all. And you don't have any audio interruption because the buffer that Dante uses is exactly the same for all the channels, and therefore when you are swapping between the main and the redundant, if there's music and there's audio feeding both channels, there's no interruption at all. So So I'm just reading the several questions that Lorenzo is, forwarding to me. So that is an important thing. So let's go back and make an example of the ears now. So if now I'm just keep playing my rig. So let me show you what I prepared here. I'm just having a tracks live. I'm just simulating two independent Pro Tools, just dividing my tracks live in two chunks of 32 channels. So in channel number 1 and 2, I have my main music. And then I can have other tracks, of course. On channel 32, I put the BLDS. What BLDS is a special artificial audio file invented and developed by DirectOut, which is basically containing a coded information, very low noise feed. So even if it happens by mistake that you are mixing a BLDS into your mix, it's not a problem because it's notable. But the BLDS is basically telling the BLDS receiver, right? So the ears mechanism inside of our devices, which is basically telling a very, very simple information. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It seems it's designed for audio people, the reason why we say 1, 2, 1, 2, because if we would have counted up to 5, we could have had a different job, but that's a different story. So 1, 2, 3 is because it is called buffer loop detection system, because if it happens that you have a loop in your DAW, it is always a power of 2, and therefore you would have had from a BLDS 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, or 2, 3, 2, 3, or 3, 1, 3, 1. So as soon as after the 1 you don't get the 2, or after the 2 you don't get the 3, you immediately understand that the loop is going on. And therefore, that's the reason why it is called buffer loop detection system, because within one sample, you understand if there's a loop going on, and therefore you have to swap over the redundant, hoping that the redundant is not in loop. And of course, if you are losing completely the BLDS, if you don't get 1, if you don't get 2, you don't get 3, you don't get anything, it means that you lost your main source, and therefore you have to go through the redundant ones. So the buffer loop detection system is an audio file that can be generated with a software generator available on the DirectOut website for Mac and PC. You can decide which is the length of the file that you need. You can decide which is the sample rate that you need, and you're just playing throughout the several audio tracks that you have. For a live show and not a playback show, remember that in the Prodigy series, both the MP and the MC, in the generator, you have the BLDS generated real time. So you can have it and route it towards the output among a MADI feeds or a Dante or whatever. And in that case, you don't even have to play it back, but the BLDS can be generated in real time from the Prodigy series. Going back to the ears, so now if you are getting the feeds from your Pro Tools rig, and you are receiving both the channel 32, which is the BLDS, and the channel 64, you see that the Pro Tools is good for both the main and the redundant, and therefore, let me see if I can put that together. So you should be able to see more. So now you see the receiving situation of ears. So if I mute now the BLDS number 32, which is simulating a complete crash of the first Pro Tools rig, you would see that the BLDS on channel 32 disappeared. Ears got that situation, and therefore the system is now providing the second half of the Dante, and therefore the backup situation is in place. Since I can set the priority, if I have the priority on main, as soon as I unmute the channel 32 and my BLDS is back, the system is preferring to get back to the main. If I keep auto enabled, there's no reason to go back and forth. So if I fail on the main, I go on backup. If the main is back, there's no reason to go back to the backup because it's auto, so it stays there. Only if I now mute the 64, which is the simulation of the failure of the second one, and therefore if I mute this, Now it goes back to the main because it was in auto. So you can decide inside of the settings of the ears if you want to have the main, if main is available, or backup is backup over value, or auto selected. If now I set again both the first and the second system active, I can select, I can check the BLDS available in both channel number 32 and 64, and therefore I have both my main Pro Tools and my backup Pro Tools perfectly working. Once again, it's extremely important that you understand that if you have to switch between the first half and the second half, the substitution is not made on the output side, but it's just replacing the input inside of the internal routing system of the PRODIGY.MP. And therefore, the entire input, 32 channel of Dante, are substituted on the input side with the second half. And therefore, if I switch off now the ears, I have my plan 64 channel of Dante independently managed. And therefore, if I go back to the DSP, in those flex channels, I patched individually Dante network number 1 as a backup, Dante network 33. So now, since I have them separated, right, if I now mute the first channel, the first stereo track on this one, I can see that I am losing just the first and the second. But I have the backup valid because now they are independent. So this is Dante 1 and 2, this is Dante 33 and 34, and therefore it's normal to have that situation. But if I enable the ears, right, now there's no difference between main and redundant because it's automatically decided before getting inside of my processor. So if now I mute the channel 32, now those channels are both fed with the second half, and therefore I can mute the first channel. You see that the first channel is muted there. It's here, it's muted. But you see that I still have the ears main and redundant because actually they are exactly the same feeds. The same for the BLDS, which becomes another independent feed. The BLDS detector is constantly monitoring individually 32 and 64. Based on that, the decision is taken in order to forward in input the first or the second half. I hope I've been clear enough, because this is a typical mistake. You think that the output is changed depending on the BLDS situation, but it's not true. The input is completely replaced at the origin, and therefore you have to be careful and patch again, both on the first and the second half, the channels which shouldn't swap because of the ears, and of course patch differently from Pro Tools main the first half and Pro Tools backup the second half. Okay, so now I can let you listen the result of the ears, just going back to the DSP, and this is not the input manager that we are listening to, but ears, main, and backup. So now I'm playing. The tracks is just started again. Now I'm simulating a complete failure of the first Pro Tools, muting channel number 32. Ears took place, because that is, but I didn't hear anything because I had the second one in place. And if I check the settings, ears is working. If I go back, I unmute the channel 64, simulating the return of the main Pro Tools, and you didn't hear anything. In order to let you believe that is actually happening a swap, I usually change on purpose the audio between main and redundant so you can really understand that it's swapping. Of course, this is something that you shouldn't do when you play. This is the backup because it was in auto. So this is the main, right? Now I'm simulating on purpose the failure, and on purpose I put on the backup track a different kind of music so you can really believe that when the swap is happening, you don't hear anything if you have exactly the same track, but of course, you have a completely different feed. And this is the evidence that is working perfectly. If I unmute again the channel 32, which is the BLDS of the first half, and this is the swapping is happening. It is happening in one sample, and that sample is already in the buffer, so you don't hear anything. Okay, so that is how the ears is working on the inside of the Prodigy series. That is enough when you want to rely on the fact that only Pro Tools main and redundant can fail, which is most of the time enough for an average show. So once you have a redundant situation for Pro Tools, main and backup, then you should consider yourself, safe. But what if it's not Pro Tools failing, but something in the between, or one of the connections between Pro Tools and the other thing? So let me go back here and tell you more in details about how everything is connected. So the Pro Tools was connected to a MacBook Pro running a Dante Virtual Sound card. And one of the problems of the Dante Virtual Sound card is that you don't really have a primary and a secondary connection. So I'm having two different Pro Tools rigs just because I want to be sure that everything is flawlessly changing in case I have a problem in the Pro Tools rig main, and I would have the Pro Tools backup. But if something is happening at the layer of the infrastructure, meaning the Ethernet connection or one of the primary or secondary switch, well, then I have a bigger problem, because no matter what is the connection, and no matter what is the status of the Pro Tools, if Dante primary is failing, I'm completely out of the game, because Dante Virtual Sound card connected to either a Mac or a PC doesn't make any difference. Even if you equip your Pro Tools rig Mac with a second independent Ethernet adapter, it's the Dante Virtual Sound card which is asking you, should I use the first or the second adapter? But I cannot use both adapters at the same time. And therefore, all the devices connected to Dante primary and secondary, such as the Yamaha CL5, would have seen my Pro Tools rig only if connected to the Pro Tools primary. Sorry, the Dante primary and not the Dante secondary. So how this problem is, managed somehow? Of course, we cannot rely only on a Dante primary. We definitely need Dante primary and secondary. So here's the trick. Thanks to the fact that the Dante I/O or the Dante SRC I/O, in this case we were using for the playback Dante I/O because everything was synchronized on the Dante clock, you have magically 3 different ports. The SFP cage can be equipped with either a fiber SFP or a RJ45. This is not making difference at the moment. This is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that the first RJ45 is fixed to primary when you are using Dante in a redundant structure. The second one is fixed to secondary. But the good news is that the third port can be decided by you, the user, if it should be connected in switch mode with primary or secondary, or when you are giving up with Dante primary and secondary, all the 3 ports are connected as if they were part of the same switch. In this case, we used primary on the SFP, connected straight to the PRODIGY.MP, connecting straight the PRODIGY.MP and the computer running the Pro Tools main. So we had no potential failure of a switch in the between. So we could consider the Pro Tools rig running on the Mac and the Prodigy as one device, unless you consider that the cable can fail. Okay, well, at that point, there's nothing you can do. Then, of course, you have the secondary port, which is the one retweeting the result of ears happening inside of the cards, and therefore, what you are really feeding towards the Dante network in terms of Pro Tools feeds is not a direct feed of your primary connection of Pro Tools, but is the result of the decision took by ears inside of the Prodigy, and therefore what you are sending towards the console, for example, in this case, is not the Dante feeds from the Pro Tools rig, but is the Dante feeds from the PRODIGY.MP. And the good news is that at that point, that feed towards the console, or several consoles, if more than one, are available both in primary and secondary style, because that is the connection which is coming from the Prodigy and not straight from the Pro Tools rig running on a MacBook Pro. So, thanks to the trick of the 3 ports, this is the connection in detail. The MacBook Pro Pro Tools main primary port is connected straight with a cable straight into the Dante port number 1 primary of the MP2 bridge. The redundant MacBook Pro with the Pro Tools backup is following exactly the same logic. So the primary port, which is the only one available from that Dante Virtual Sound card, straight connected, no switch in the between, towards the Dante primary port of the backup mix. This is where, through the switches, thanks to the fact that those 2 ports inside of the Prodigy card, the Dante card, are like in the same switch, then the primary of the computer is forwarded towards the primary and primary with the trunking system between the 2 switches. The 2 switches were connecting in trunking mode with the tagging of the several VLANs by means of a stack of switches, both primary and secondary. But pay attention. The primary in this switch has been connected while the secondary was connected to the other switch to prevent failure of the same switch breaking both primary and secondary of the same Dante card. So we were considering this one primary for this one and secondary for this one, but reversing the logic for the second one. So the primary of this one was connected here, and the secondary was connected to this switch, and the primary of this one connected to the switch. Thanks to the trunking, both switches were bringing and distributing all the primary and secondary ports of Dante. So if everything goes in the right direction, the main Pro Tools rig is feeding this Dante bridge MP2 in ears. So whatever happens to the first and the second, both of them, thanks to the switches, are getting both the feeds, the main and the redundant, and ears is then deciding what to be fed towards the Dante primary and the Dante secondary, and the Yamaha is happily receiving the result of the ears between the PRODIGY.MP to Dante bridge. So the standard patch from Dante controller is that this Yamaha CL5 is receiving the feeds of what has been forwarded to Dante from this PRODIGY.MP. Is that a straight connection between ears, main and redundant? Not actually, because we wanted to survive a failure of whatever happened before, and therefore, since we had the input manager connected with the coaxial, what has been forwarded towards Dante as a Pro Tools result was the result of ears for Dante main and Dante backup, but also an additional checking if, in case both Dante main and redundant would have been failed from this portion of the switch or from this portion of Pro Tools, if the feed from the Pro Tools would have arrived from the MIDI coaxial from the other backup, that was actually the one really feeding the Dante primary and secondary in order to keep the console happy. If you use a software like the one I'm using, which is OmniGraffle or something like that, if you prepare those schematics, they are extremely useful because you simply have to delete some of the blocks and to see what is happening in case of a failure. So that is the normal complete structure. So let's try to think about what if main Pro Tools fails. I simply delete that and it's clear what is left. Okay, so I have the Pro Tools backup, which is connected straight to this Prodigy towards Dante. Dante is feeding both the primary and secondary feeds, and therefore the ears working perfectly. Doesn't matter if I don't have the first one. So ears is enough to have the possibility to have in this PRODIGY.MP the perfect feed from the backup Pro Tools in real time, not even losing a sample, and therefore what is feeding the real Dante primary and secondary as a Pro Tools result is the one which is feeding the console. So ears is enough to, you know, survive the the Pro Tools main failure, as, you know, is the first thing that you usually do. But what if backup Pro Tools fails? Well, first of all, if it's just a backup, it's not a problem. But in this case, there's no really a difference between Pro Tools main and backup, because it's ears managed, so it's just 1 and 2, or A and B. There's not really a main or a backup. Having said that, the Pro Tools rig usually is kept aligned in terms of MIDI command for locate, play, and stop, and blah, 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 because of course the operator can only operate on one Pro Tools, and if something goes wrong, the operator is working on the other one, but the operation on one Pro Tools is of course immediately, you know, delivered to the other one. But that is just a, you know, a timing thing and not an audio thing, right? A command. So if the Pro Tools backup fails, just delete that from the normal schematic, and therefore you only have the main one. If the main one, it goes straight to the main Dante port of this device here. Ears is just picking up this one because the second one is not valid, and therefore is pushing towards Dante primary and Dante secondary through two different switches in cluster, in stack towards the Dante console. And the console is absolutely happy receiving all the Pro Tools feed. Okay, that is all about, you know, what is happening. If I would have stopped thinking about the failure here, you know, I could have considered myself, you know, safe enough because I have a Pro Tools rig and a backup a Pro Tools rig. But what if switch 1 fails? Okay, well, not a big deal, because if switch 1 fails, let me evaluate that. I still have my MacBook Pro with Pro Tools main connected straight to my Prodigy. My Prodigy, the first one, which is getting the feed, is not getting the feed of the second one, because the second one is not connected to the primary here, but guess what? This one is getting this one, which is valid, not the other one, and therefore, if I combine these Pro Tools here and these Pro Tools with the input manager from this side, I still have two different Pro Tools. So I'm not depending on either one Pro Tools, even if I completely lose one of the switch, thanks to the fact that if this switch fails, I have the, let's say, another collateral trunking thanks to the input manager, and therefore there's no even need to use the input manager because the Pro Tools main is the one going through the output. The output of this one is not available as a main for the console because the console was connected to this switch, but thanks to the fact that I divided main, primary, and secondary into different switches, the result of the ears is fed towards the secondary, and the secondary is valid from the console, and the console is just showing me that the primary disappeared, but the secondary is taking over glitchlessly. No problem at all. So, once again, I'm safe. And even if that Pro Tools would have failing, what if the switch 2 fails? Is mirrored situation. The Pro Tools, both our Pro Tools are good, are both connected straight to the two Prodigies. Therefore, I have the Dante connecting here. The Dante is pushing the primary and the primary here. So Dante primary is okay. Ears and Dante primary. And even if ears is not capable to work because I miss the second Pro Tools, because there's a missing link between Dante primary and secondary, actually the second Pro Tools is always available through the input manager again. So even if I lose, but that is managed. What if Pro Tools main and switch 1 fail? So two independent and uncorrelated unlucky situations. Should I survive? Let's see. If Pro Tools main and switch 1 fail, then thanks to ears, thanks to the input managers and Dante secondary, I'm okay. I don't even have to change a patch or something. Everything is happening automatically. How? MacBook Pro with Pro Tools backup is feeding this one. This one is getting ears. The first one is valid. No problem at all, right? But this one is feeding the secondary, but this one was patched. this one was patched from this device, not from this one. And therefore, it would require a change in the patch of Dante, which takes few seconds. But thanks to the fact that the input manager is connecting this, and the input manager is checking the availability of Dante, which is not there, and the MADI, which is there, it will bring the result of the input manager towards Dante, and therefore Dante secondary is still valid and feeding my Yamaha CL5 with no interruption at all. What if Pro Tools main and switch 2 fail? Thanks to ears plus input manager plus Dante primary, I'm still okay. Same story. I get to the first device here. The first device is valid. The first device is pushing towards the secondary here, but this is not what I wanted. This one is the standard patch because it's coming from this device. But this device is getting to the other one the result of the ears done here, and therefore here I'm pushing towards the Dante primary here, which is then forwarded to the console. So I'm saved again. Okay. What if Pro Tools backup and switch 1 fail? Well, again, ears plus Dante secondary, I'm okay. There's a connection straight, which is not depending on the switch. Ears is doing its job, and therefore I'm pushing towards Dante secondary. Dante secondary is connect me to the console. No problem at all. And on the way back, I'm getting from the Dante secondary towards the PRODIGY.MP bridge all the fits to be sent, over the rest of the rig. What if Pro Tools backup and switch 2 fail? Pro Tools backup, Dante primary, ears is working, Dante primary, I'm fine with the console, no problem at all. Okay, so it seems that you thought about all the potential issues and also not independent, combining different potential failure. But, and what if the MP1 fails? The PRODIGY MP1 fails. So the device that you wanted to use to increase the level of redundancy is the one which is in the end failing for some reason, because it's not your lucky star at night. Well, you have to survive. How you survive? Thanks to the ears, thanks to the Dante primary and secondary which are in place. No problem at all. So the MP1 fails, okay, you don't get the Pro Tools feed second, right? But you have the first one, ears, Dante primary, there you go. And if you're really having no possibility to back this up and your Pro Tools is still okay, you just reconnect one cable, getting disconnected from the PRODIGY.MP, which is not there any longer, getting to the secondary, the second switch in the primary VLAN, and you re-establish your Pro Tools main and backup, no problem at all with just one PRODIGY.MP. Mirrored situation, what if the MP2 fails? Well, then you would lose immediately in real time the Pro Tools main, but thanks to the ears and the second Pro Tools, you don't have any interruption. Everything is working from here, right? And the fact that you are connecting to the secondary here and the primary here, through the secondary and to the primary, you have both primary and secondary, okay, and you are absolutely fine. No problem at all. So, as you can see, you really have to think about all the potential failure, and you have the possibility to, in this case, if the first device is not there any longer, which was the originally one patched towards the Yamaha CL5, you have to add one thing, which is important. You have to change the Dante patch recall, because everything now is available from this Dante device, but not any longer from the original one. So the information are available inside of the Dante networking, but the patch that you have to change is the one feeding the console. In that case, the ears plus Dante primary and secondary, plus you have to remember to change a patch recall, but that was the MP2 fails and one of the two things. You had all the other covered automatically. So the only one which is requiring a Dante patch recall is this situation where one of the two PRODIGY.MPs is failing, the one which was really feeding the Dante feeds towards the console. So this is more or less the entire thing. I know that there's a lot of information. I know that, you know, some of them must be digested. I think that it's now the right time to go through some of the questions, and I invite Lorenzo to come over here just in case I need some time. So let me, okay. Did all the PRODIGY.MPs appears in one common Globcon interface? Yes, and as I showed you, all the PRODIGY.MPs appears in the same Globcon interface. Of course, I had a second computer connected to Globcon, identical project, identical global snapshot, in order to have also a redundant computer. Although the computer is just a remote control, it would never interrupt the audio, but yes, the answer is yes. Were you sending a common LTC feed to both Pro Tools systems? Wouldn't the LTC feed be a single point of failure? We were not sending any LTC to Pro Tools. Pro Tools was generating the LTC. Which Ethernet switches were you using? There were a combination of switches. The stack ones were Cisco's, big ones. I don't remember the name. This is a question for Claudio Scavazza. I was not responsible for that. And a combination for the trunking and the several switches around were Aruba, the HP brand. You were integrating a system of this scale with SunGrid instead of Dante. If you were integrated, wouldn't there be a single point of failure in the SunGrid host running Emotion LV1 SunGrid Studio? Yes and no. It means that as far as I know, if a SunGrid node disappears, and if there's another one that can re-establish the SunGrid situation, it would have been exactly the same. So I wouldn't think that the SunGrid would have been a single point of failure. Did you use a Dante Virtual Sound card for the Pro Tools systems, or did you use a Dante PCIe card for the lower latency? No, we did use the Virtual Sound card for Pro Tools systems because we didn't have to, you know, cope with the particular, you know, strict requirement in terms of latency, because it was just a you know, a playback things, and Bocelli was singing on the track, so no problem at all. That we work only 48 kilohertz. No, we worked at 48 kilohertz, right? But we were not forced to work at 48 kilohertz. We would have worked at 96 kilohertz with no problem. We just would have had the limitation of 16, actually 15 plus 1 for the first half of Dante, but 15 Dante feeds, including Pro Tools and all the microphones, would have been enough, and therefore we could have used definitely 96 kilohertz. But the entire job, the tracks and everything was 48 kilohertz, and therefore we didn't really, you know, had to. No problem at all. We could have done both. And as I told at the beginning, independently from the sample rate decided by the broadcasters and the PA people. Could both DAW playback and network redundancy be achieved by use of the two network slots? Yes, of course, but at least in one of the devices, we needed the second slot to connect the external world, such as the broadcast and the PA. So we could have used in one of the two rigs the two independent network card of Dante, but in order to keep all the possibilities of any exchange of any single point of failure, the design that I put together is much more redundant, because I don't really have a single point of failure, as you could see. One for the playback DAWs and the other network for card network redundancy. Yes, as I told you, I already explained the reason why I wanted to keep all the symmetrical design in order to be able to, thanks to the fact that the input manager could have been, you know, crossing the information between the first and the second PRODIGY.MP, I could have any kind of combination of failure and multiple failure at the same time, and I could survive with no problem at all. The last thing I want to show you, and then we say hello to everyone. This webinar will remain available on YouTube, on our DirectOut channel, and therefore you can digest it step by step. I can publish a PDF with all the schematics. I have no secrets, and I have the rights to publish whatever I design, so no problem at all. And we will be available in the next days or in our social channels to answer any kind of question might arise in the future. The only thing I want to show you is that I had to have several global snapshot in place, the standard one, the Yamaha fault recalled, and the Yamaha plus MP1 fault. They were the three snapshots I had to get prepared and to recall in case of a problem. So in the standard global snapshot, you see that the standard global snapshot was actually recalling three different snapshots into three different devices. The MP1 backup mix, called backup mix, standard snapshot, the Dante Bridge MP2 standard snapshot, and the MP3 aux. If I open the standard snapshot of the MP backup mix number 1, you're right, Lorenzo. You have to remember me that I have to change this stuff. So I had three different global snapshots, right? The standard, the Yamaha fault, and the Yamaha plus the MP1 fault. In the standard global snapshot, actually, it's a combination of three different snapshots, one for each device. In the backup mix, in the standard network, the only thing I had to change was the slot output. And in case of Yamaha fault, once again, would have been the slot output, because anything else would have remained exactly as it was. Absolutely. In the Yamaha fault, right, in the backup mix, again, the Yamaha fault would have changed only something in the slot, and in the slot is what was, actually, feeding the local analog output, right? All the rest would have remained absolutely unchanged. This is another incredibly important feature regarding the Globcon implementation and the snapshots inside of the Prodigy series. You are not forced to recall a memory or a snapshot for the total amount of parameters, but you are the one deciding which are the parameters that should be recalled on a very, very granular approach. So if I get there and I select something, I can see that in this snapshot only the 8 channels of the local analog output have been recalled, nothing else, right? The different situation is in the other devices. So for example, in the Dante Bridge, in case I have to change something from one fault in the others, in the other case, that would have been completely different. Whatever I should have sent towards the external network or towards the internal network, depending on the several situation. There were different things. So if I'm recalling the standard one, and I can see which is the routing towards the external Dante network, I can see that the main feeds towards the broadcast and the PA in a standard situation would have received by the other Dante, which was bringing the Yamaha main backup, the several linear monitors, music clean, and all the other stuff. What should have happened in case of a Yamaha fault? Recall that snapshot. I go to the routing. You see that the routing is changed. Now it's coming from the MADI2 B and C because it was the result of the input manager of the other device, right? Because the other device would have been the main mix, and therefore I didn't want to take any risk. I had already to change the console, and therefore I wanted to have a very reliable connection between the new console, which was the other device, and the one which was performing as a bridge between the first and the second. So I was grabbing the main feeds from the PRODIGY.MP used as a console and sending towards the Dante external. That was the only thing that was changing in that. In case of Yamaha plus MP1 fault, once again, that was not even coming any longer from the second device. The second device is supposed to be broken at that point. In this case, is the internal matrix, which is feeding left and right, all the feeds, because the same device was the one acting like a console at the moment, and therefore, in the several snapshots, I only changed whatever should have been changed, in order to have the guarantee that the minimum amount of things would have been changed, only whatever has been tested, and the last time decision took during the rehearsal or very last minute during the show wouldn't have been changed from an unwanted recall of parameters that shouldn't have been changed during the emergency situation managed by the several snapshots that you prepared. And having the possibility to test during the rehearsal, it's great to see how relaxing is the situation. You just, do this and you see that nobody is complaining, nothing is lost, all the in-ear monitors are working, all the feeds are working. You can stop one Pro Tools trick the other one is taking over. You can switch off one switch, simulating its failure, and it's over. And you keep doing that as long as you can test all your, global snapshots. You can test all the failure, the potential failure of any component, and you really double check for real whatever is supposed to work in theory. Then you really enjoy your show, and you really usually don't need any of those redundant aspects, because the Murphy law is always there ready to teach you a lesson, and therefore whenever you have all the redundancy in place, you don't need anything. When you don't have something in place, be sure that the risk of having regrets about that is very high. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. As I told you, I know there's a lot of information, and I understand that it can be a little bit hard to digest everything in one shot. But let's do like the vaccine, get the second shot if you want, and have a look at the webinar in offline. This webinar will remain available, and as I told you before, whenever you have further questions, or you want to have a one-to-one chat, or you want to have further information regarding any aspect of what I told you about in this webinar, just come back. Have a good time, have a good night in Europe and in Asia, have a good day in the US. Bye-bye, see you next time.